Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to learn about methods in Java. So the first thing we're going to do is let's just look at the syntax of how to write a method. So first you have your return type, then you have your method name, followed by arguments in a parenthesis and your code in your two curly braces. So first, let's start off by defining a few terms. First off, what are arguments? So arguments are values that are passed to the value defined in the method header. So basically, I'll show you guys an example of that really quick. Moving this down. Okay. So an example of that would basically be something like, say we have this function, this method, right? And what we'll do is that there are two arguments, both in which have to be integers, right? So this one has to say be int add underscore nums with two arguments, int I, int j, and say we have code int k is equal to I plus j, and return k. Say we have this, right? And in order for us to conduct this operation, we need to go to our main method, say it's public static main public static void main string args right? And in this main, what we're going to do is say we have a class, public class pract1. So we have something like this, right? And we'll put our two curly braces here. So here, if we want to implement this, we need to input two operations, right? So first, what we're going to do is create an object. So prac1 obj equals new prac1 dot, right? So for this obj, we're going to use this object to use add underscore nums. And the two numbers that we're going to input to add would be the two arguments, right? So this is an example of an argument. So later on in the video, we're going to get into more detail about this, but just as a brief example, the input that you put will be passed, 10 will be assigned to int I, and 15 will be assigned to int j. So that's what we mean by passed. You're going to basically assign 10 to int I and 15 to int j, and all the operations will be performed. So int k is equal to 10 plus 15 in this same order, and it's going to return the value k is equal to 25, right? So this is basically what goes on behind the scenes. So now let's look at another term that we need to define, right? Which is return type. So the return type is the data type of what is being returned by the method, right? Okay. So in this, let's just look at our brief example of add nums, right? In this one, we're returning an integer value for everything. Since our values, so since we have declared our return type to be int, that means that the arguments data type should also be int. And everything, the value that returns or the value of k should always be an integer, right? And so that's why your return type would be int for this example. So now let's just go over a case which is known as a void, right? So usually in all methods, you'd have a return type, a data type like int, double, float, etc., right? But what if my method doesn't return a value? Well, that means your return type will be void, which only happens when a method does not return a value. We'll get more into this in our example questions, but one of the most common examples of this is system.out.print and whatever in this, right? So since it's not actually returning a value, it's printing something, it doesn't have a return type. So your return type for this one would be void. So now let's get into looking to some examples, right? But so in our examples, we're actually going to go over the 4 types of methods. So which let's just go over really quickly. We'll get into more understanding. The first one is void return type with no arguments. The second one is a valid return type. So return type with arguments. The third one is void return type with arguments. And the final one is return type with no arguments. Oops. Right. So basically, this is just possible combinations of what could happen in a code. So let's just look into examples of this, right? So I'll just reshare my screen to my coding. Okay. So I'm using the Eclipse the Eclipse application for my Java. And yeah, I just thought you guys should know that. Okay. So the first thing we're going to do is let's just go over the problem statement. Conduct all operations of arithmetic on the numbers 70 and 35. I think what we're going to do is we're actually going to refine it a bit, and we're going to use the basic operations such as addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Okay, so and let's aim to use like all 4 types of methods, right? So the first thing we're going to do is create our addition method. So I'm going to create a comment and label it addition method. And what we're actually going to do is we're going to create this in the public class that's created. So now what we're going to do is when you're writing your program, we always have to write the return type and the method name first. So I think I'm going to do void return type with no arguments for this one. So I'm just going to put this void with no args. Okay. So let's write our code. Void add nums is always good to abbreviate so that you don't do any, like it doesn't get too overcomplicated. And then you're going to put your 2 curly braces to add your code inside. I always like to I'd like to see my code in between 2 curly braces like so, just so that I know where my curly braces are and it avoids any confusion. So then what we're going to do is let's think about what we do when we want to add these two numbers, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to declare int I and equate it to 70 and int j and equate it to 35. So now that we have this, we can actually create a new variable int k and equate it to the sum of I plus j so that we've created a variable that holds the sum, right? So now all we need to do is we need to print it. So system.out.print, ln k, our variable k, right? And oops, I added an extra parentheses. And this is my function add nums. Now let's create our subtraction method. Let's make it void return type with argument. So now we already know we're creating it void, so our return type should be void. Subnums, so I can abbreviate it, make it less complicated, add our curly braces. There we go. Okay, so in subtraction, I'm just subtracting two numbers, right? But I actually need to create my argument. And since it has void data type, it actually return type, it actually doesn't matter what I make my it doesn't really matter what data type my arguments are, but since I'm using integer values of 70 and 35, I'm going to make mine int I and int j. So now what we're going to do is we're going to, since we've already declared our variables in here, all we're going to do is we're going to write int k is equal to I minus j. And since we have void, we're just going to do system.out.println and k. And basically all ln does is it basically presses enter and prints the value from the previous method or from the previous output. Okay, so since that is over, that was a really confusing explanation. I apologize. But moving on, let's go to multiplication. And let's make this, okay, return type with no arguments. Okay, so we have a return type, and since we're multiplying two integers, 70 and 35, we're going to make it int mult nums, right? Click enter, like so. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is, the reason why it's giving you an error is because the method doesn't have anything to make the value int. So it's giving you an error just to warn you that the method isn't returning anything. And if it's not going to return anything, it should be void, right? So, but let's just begin. Because we don't have any arguments, we have to define the variables inside the method. So we're going to make it int I is equal to 70 and int j is equal to 35, right? Oops, not 25, 35. And now what we're going to do is we're going to make int k set I times j, right? And what we're going to do is, for us we need to return a value. So all you're going to do is type return k. And since the value k is defined as int, you're returning an integer value and therefore your error is gone, right? So now that we know that, let's get into creating our final method, which is division, which is return type with, with argument. Okay, so now we have int div nums because it's int because we are able to divide, and we're going to get integer value when we divide 70 by 35. So what we're going to do now is we have to define our variables in the method header. So that's int I, int j, because we have an int return type, we need to have integer values. Now what we're going to do is, since we've already declared it in the method header, we're simply going to type int k is equal to I divided by j and return k. There. So see, what this does is it basically just it's returning an integer value because it's 70 divided by 35. And since k, the variable k, has an int data type, it matches with the return type, so it takes away the error. So now let's actually execute these methods, right? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to stay in the public class, but we're going to return main method, public static void main. Oops. Right, so this is the basic point. So now what we're going to do is we're actually going to create objects of the class methods and then implement our functions. Now, what you could do is you could actually take out all of these functions from this class and make them all static. That way you can just call the method, you'll just call the method and it would work, but it's not recommended as it just takes up too much memory space, and it's better if you just create objects. So what we're going to do is we're going to type in methods underscore ex obj new methods example, right, like this, and obj dot add nums. And since it has no return type, we don't need to do anything else. It has void, so it's just going to print it out for us. We'll just create another object like this and enable it obj1 and do subtract nums again. Oh, okay. And this one has arguments. So what we're going to do is we're going to type in 70, 35. To then, and it'll print it out for us since we have system.out.println. Now here comes the interesting part, right? So let's create our third object. And let's do most nums, right? And this one doesn't have any values. It's just going to return a value. So let's see what happens when we execute this code, right? We're only getting 2 values printed, right? So the reason this is happening is because we're returning a value. So we're just getting a value but we're not actually doing anything with it. So the way you're going to print this is you're going to equate it to a variable, say int f, and you're going to do system.out.println f. You're going to print the variable. That way, you have your third value printed. So let's just repeat this process for our last piece of code. Create our fourth object. Remember, the name of the object can actually be anything you want. So I'm just actually going to create a new variable, say u, and change this to u. And we're going to make this div nums. And then again, we have arguments in this one. So you have to type in 70, 35. So when we execute this code, it's going to look something like this, right? So just to make our code a bit more clear, it's always good to write down what's being printed. So what we're going to do is we're going to write system.out.print and not ln, because I don't want to go addition, enter 35. I don't want it to be a title. I just want it to be one single line. So I'm just going to type in addition and put my semicolon. I'm going to copy paste this piece of code and change it. Right? Okay. So now when we run this code, we have, oops, okay. Forgot a colon and a space, my bad. We have all of our code, right? Our wanted values. So this is how you use methods in Java. I will post the note sheet shortly after this video. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you have any suggestions, as always, please do put them down in the comments or feel free to email me. And yeah, thank you so much. Bye.